Well, now, we are in Revelation 13. Revelation 13 is perhaps the most well-known chapter of the book of Revelation besides chapter 20, and it is one of the most discussed chapters of Revelation. I mentioned to you early on in our study how that there was a heavy metal group of the early 80s called Iron Maiden that released an album called The Number of the Beast, in which they had a guy at the very outset of the album reading from Revelation 13 in a very deep, sonorous voice. And on the cover of their album, it was a cartoonish depiction of an actual beast, a giant beast terrorizing, it looked like, New York City. Well, unfortunately, that's what too many people have in mind when they think about the beast of Revelation. Or they have in mind something on the order of the Omen movies. Do you remember The Omen that came out in 1976 with Gregory Peck? Remember, Gregory Peck starred in that movie, and they had a child that had the mark of the beast on the back of its neck. Remember that? The 666 in a triangular shape. And the whole movie was about this child, and when he grew up to be a toddler, terrorizing everybody because he was the spawn of Satan. And at the end of it, Gregory Peck tries to take care of him, and he gets shot himself, and then it goes on for Omen 2, and then the other Omen movie that came out after that. They made a remake of that movie in 2006 with Liev Schreiber, and it was not as good as the original. It had some more special effects than the original movie, but at any rate, it made good Hollywood movies. But as far as telling the truth about Revelation and Revelation 13, not on your life. It took literally what Revelation 13 is symbolically portraying. But what is the deal with 666? Have you ever had people that have had an account number with 666 in it, and they say, oh, I've got to change that. I've got to change that. You ever heard of anybody doing that? Of course. Because 666 has such a stigma attached to it. And in the context of Revelation, 666 is, of course, as we're going to see, the ultimate personification of evil. Whatever and whoever it represents is representing something that is completely sinful, completely evil. Now, the chart that you have in front of you, the handout, hopefully everybody got a handout of it, this depicts some attempts to tell who 666 stands for. And on the left-hand column, you can see that there are 4 rows of letters and numbers. The top row are the Hebrew letters. The second row is the Greek letters. Third row are Roman numerals. Fourth row are the Arabic numerals. Now, each letter of the Greek and the Hebrew corresponds to a certain number. And when you do a combination of those numbers, you can get 666. Revelation 13:18, you can see on the top of that page the Greek lettering as it appears in the text, which is 666. Revelation 13:18 tells us that. Now, in the box below, you have some attempts as to who 666 represents. There were those that would say it was Titus, Taton in the Greek, and that would be correspondent to 666. But, as we will point out, Titus is not the person, if you're going to apply it to a person. Then there are those in the early church who thought it represented the Latin man, or Latinos. In other words, a generalized application to the Latin man, that is the Roman emperor in a general sense. And that is a possibility. Then, perhaps the most well-known application among many is the application to Nero, or Nero Caesar. Now notice the parentheses. Omission of the final noun subtracts 50, leaving the variant 616. Irenaeus, I believe it was, mentioned about that there were some who had subtracted a number and came up with 616. He didn't know why that was the case. Well, it's because of the difference between the Hebrew and the Latin. There is an omission of a final noun, and that leaves you with 616. But at any rate, whether it's Nero Caesar or Neron Caesar, there were those that would apply it to Nero. Then there are those that would apply it to the Emperor Diocletian, Diocles Augustus, and you can see the Roman numeral system, the Roman numerals that are applied to his name that add up to 666. Then there are some that said it was Julian the Apostate. Now, you know, if you're ever named the Apostate, I mean, how far can you go in religion when you're known as the Apostate? But at any rate, Julian the Apostate, or Julianus Caesar Atheus. And you can see again the numbering that is applied to him. Then there are those that would say it was Luther. That is Martin Luther. And they would apply the Hebrew lettering to his name, 666. And then some suggested the lustrous one, or Lampetus. And they would say that was the 666. Or there were those that would say, no, it's the Italian church, applying it to the Roman Catholic Church. Italica Ecclesia, Italica Ecclesia. So they would say it's the Roman Catholic Church. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that once we get into the text of Revelation 13. Then there are some that say it would be the Latin Kingdom, or a Latine Basileia, the Latin Kingdom, which of course again would refer to either the Roman Catholic Church or the Roman Empire. Then some have suggested the apostate, or apostates in the Greek. That would be correspondent, they would say, to 666. Then some how should I say, people who were very, I can't think of the word to use. They were very ingenious, lack of a better term, in coming up with this. They would say it's the Roman See, and that's the Hebrew lettering there that would correspond to 666, or the Roman man. And of course that would also add up to 666. Then there were some that suggested that on the crown that the Pope of Rome wears, it says Vice-Regent of the Son of God. Now that is not confirmed, but there were those that suggested that on the crown of the Pope, those words, Vice-Regent of the Son of God, is what John had in mind. And if you put it down in Latin terms, Vicaris Filii Dei, that would add up to 666. Well, you know, that's smart, but I don't think it's really what John is talking about. Then some have suggested that it was Mussolini. Remember Mussolini of World War II? Some of you, Mussolini, Viva il Duce, long live the chief, at 666. And then I could also say that there are those that said Adolf Hitler was the beast, 666. And then in more recent times, Richard Nixon, some suggested, was the beast. Or Leonid Brezhnev, or Jimmy Carter, or you go on and on and on. Well, that's getting into the realm of fanciful thinking. Then Brother Hugo McCord, the late Brother Hugo McCord, that taught for many years at Oklahoma Christian University, is now passed away. Brother McCord taught Revelation. And one of his enterprising students took Brother McCord's name, Brother Carl H. McCord, and transliterated it into Greek letters. And so he said Carl H. McCord, Hugo McCord's name, equaled 666. Brother McCord said the mark of the beast given to that student was an F. There's been a lot of ingenious ways to try to say who the 666 refers to. Who does it refer to? We'll get to that in a moment. Let's get into the chapter first, shall we? Chapter 13, it says, and I, or the American Standard says, he stood upon the sand of the sea. Now, what is that sea? There's been speculation as to what sea that would represent. Could be the Tyrrhenian Sea, which bordered the land of Italy. Don't really know. We can't really say for certain what sea it is. It's just the sea, the sand of the sea. And I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads. Now, the number 7 normally refers to deity. That is in God's realm, but in the context here, it is not referring to anything good. It's simply referring to great wisdom. 7 heads in this case is great wisdom. And 10 horns. This is great power. He has great wisdom and great power. And upon his horns 10 crowns. That represents great authority. And upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Upon each of his heads were the name of blasphemy. Now, what is that name of blasphemy? Well, Domitian, the emperor, toward the end of the 1st century, demanded to be called Dominus et Deus. In other words, Lord and God. He required it. The first Caesar to do so. And we've talked a little bit about Domitian already, how twisted he was and how much of a tyrant he was. This would fit, it seems to me. There are those that would say, no, it's Nero. But Nero never, as far as I know, demanded that he be worshipped. Yet Domitian did. He required it. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. Now, what do all three of these animals have in common? A leopard, a bear, and a lion. They are all ferocious animals. When they're fighting, they are ferocious and tenacious, and they don't give up. In other words, whoever this represents is a vicious, tenacious fighter. And notice, the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Now, who's behind the beast? This sea beast is Satan, the dragon. Is evil, in other words. This is an evil power. Satan is always behind anything that is evil. And it's especially the case here with this beast. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death. And his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And that's a quite interesting verse. Quite interesting image. One of his heads is crushed, but it comes back. It's killed, but yet it comes back to life. There was a myth that was circulating around this time concerning Nero. It's called the Nero revived myth. That Nero really didn't die, that he was in hiding to the east of the Roman Empire. He was waiting or biding his time to come back. Or someone like him was going to be coming up to power in the spirit of Nero, reincarnated Nero, in other words. Could this be an allusion to that? It's a possibility. We don't really need to read more into this than what's there. But it is at least a coincidence to me that through inspiration of the Holy Spirit that John writes this down as God reveals it to him through Christ to write it down. That one of his heads is killed and then it comes back to life. And it just so happens there was a myth circulating about Nero, the same thing. Domitian was much like Nero, but much worse. In other words, there are a lot of similarities, but Domitian was a far worse emperor than Nero was. And they worshipped the dragon, which, or because, he gave power, or his authority, unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? As far as I know, Domitian was the first Roman emperor to require that the people worship him and worship his image. And as I showed you early on, the pictures of the ruins of the temple of Domitian, and then also artist depiction of how that temple looked when it was actually erected and not damaged. It was a huge, huge edifice. And the remains of the statue of Domitian that were there alone, the forearm alone is taller than most well-grown men. It's a huge, huge structure. Domitian had that much power and wanted to exert that much power when he was sitting on the throne as Caesar. And there was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. And power or authority was given unto him to continue 42 months. 42 months or 3.5 years. There's that number again. 3.5. 3.5. This, of course, symbolizes the period of Roman persecution against the church in particular. Has a definite beginning and a definite ending. It's intense, but it's something that Christians must undergo. So this is talking about the persecution that would take place against the church from the Roman emperor, and I believe it is talking about Domitian in particular. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. Now I must mention here that there are those that would have a problem with Domitian being the beast and Domitian actually persecuting Christians, because they say there's no evidence to indicate that Domitian ever persecuted Christians. But just because we don't have any evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. Because what we do know about Domitian, from what was written about him from his contemporaries and those that survived him, is enough to tell us that he was a mean guy. And that's an understatement. He didn't have any problem killing his enemies. He didn't have any problem wiping out his enemies in one fell swoop. And to imagine that he could persecute the church is not a stretch. Not a stretch whatsoever. In fact, there are those Christians later on, much later, that do say he did persecute the church. But then again, we don't have any contemporary evidence from the first century or the early second century to actually indicate that. We don't have it yet. But that's not to say it's not there. It hasn't been discovered yet. But still, the fact is, Domitian appropriated to himself the titles of deity. He refused to accept correspondence if it was not addressed to him as Supreme Lord and God. Now, can you imagine a politician this day and time saying, you've got to address me as your Lord and your God? Can you imagine the firestorm that would erupt? Well, among certain politicians, not others. Well, still, the fact is, this leader, this political leader, thought of himself as a god. Thought of himself that way. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Does that mean he is victorious? No. He overcomes them in the sense that he persecutes them for a time. Remember, 42 months, 3.5 years, a limited amount of time. But in that limited time, he would persecute the saints. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. That means he has a worldwide supremacy. Whoever this is, whether it's Domitian or whoever else it is, this person symbolizes the worldwide supremacy that he has. And can there be any doubt that Rome exercised worldwide supremacy at the end of the first century? There's no doubt about it. The Mediterranean Sea. What does the name Mediterranean mean? The Mediterranean Sea, that word means middle of the earth. Middle of the earth. That's what they considered it to be. Rome was far-reaching, all the way from Britannia in the far northwest, all the way to the very outskirts of Asia, and going toward what is now present-day Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. Even though they had problems with Parthia on their eastern border, they still posted a great empire, west, east, north, into the barbarian lands of Europe to an extent, and into the northern coast of Africa. Huge empire. So verse 8 says, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. Notice this. Everyone is worshiping the beast, except faithful children of God, faithful Christians. What really and ultimately matters is how you stand before Jesus Christ. That's really what matters. What matters is my name written in the Lamb's book of life. The book of life is mentioned in Exodus chapter 32. It's mentioned here. It's also mentioned in chapter 21. It's mentioned several places throughout the book, throughout the Bible. Is it a literal book? Well, it's a record of some sort. I don't know if we can call it a literal book, but it's described that way by John. It's a record that Christ or God has as to who is among the faithful. And that's the only record that really should matter to us. Is my name written there? If any man have an ear, let him hear. That alludes, of course, to what Jesus would quite often say when he was on the earth. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, that's what John writes. God through Christ revealing this to him. He that leadeth, or if any man is for captivity, he shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. What he's saying is those who are now or about to persecute the church, those who are now or about to kill the saints, they're going to receive the same kind of punishment. They're going to receive their just reward. And as a result, he says that is the patience, the King James reads there in verse 10. The word is actually endurance. Here is the endurance and the faith of the saints. This is what keeps you going. In other words, this is what keeps children of God going forward in the face of all of this. That there's coming a judgment on Rome. They're going to be judged in the same way that they have meted out punishment against Christians. They're going to be brought down. And that's what keeps children of God moving forward. Verse 11 says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. Now remember, the first beast came out of the land, came out of the sea. This worldwide superpower, Rome, is who I believe it represents. Now you have another beast coming up out of the earth, a land beast. And he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. He has 2 horns. That means he has some power, but it's limited. It's limited. And his speech is evil because he spoke as a dragon. What does he do? Verse 12. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Now notice, he has a form like, or has 2 horns like a lamb. He is outwardly, as far as looks are concerned, it looks like he's religious, but he's actually evil. And notice, he exercises all the power of the first beast. Now, there are some that would suggest that this is representative of the Jewish system during those days, but I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that's the case. I believe firmly that this is the committee, or however you want to put it, to enforce emperor worship throughout the empire. Those who were tasked with enforcing emperor worship. He has all the authority from the first beast. And notice verse 13, he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. It seems like he's performing miracles, but they are false signs. They are false wonders. Verse 14, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles or signs which he had power, or it was given him to do, in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. They were going to erect images, idols, if you will. And wasn't that the case in Rome? Wasn't there, or weren't there a lot of images that were erected to the emperor and to the Roman government? And weren't they put in very prominent positions? Well, of course. And was that in order to enforce or try to get people to worship the emperor and worship Rome? Of course it was. And that's what he's describing here. Verse 15. And he had power, King James says, or it was given unto him, to give life or breath unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now what does that mean? Well, if you do your homework and you do your study a little bit about history, you'll understand and find out that there were certain idols that were erected that were hollowed out. In other words, it had a place where a person could crawl inside, maybe a young child or somebody who was small in stature could crawl inside that idol and could actually stand up inside that idol, and when this person would speak normally, it would come out of a hole up toward the top of the idol, normally where the mouth would be, and when that person would speak, that voice would be amplified. And for those who did not know, they would think that the idol was actually speaking. Well, this could be what this represents. In other words, deception. They would employ deception to try to get people, entice people, force people to worship the image of the beast. And if they didn't, then they would be put to death. They would suffer severe consequences. The late Brother W.B. West, in his oral lectures on Revelation, which, by the way, you can get that through Gospel Advocate. It's in book form. Revelation through first century glasses. Brother West talks about this at length in all the research and the studies that he has done or had done on the subject about what all was involved with this. And it's very, very compelling. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand, or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Have you ever heard of the mark of the beast? Of course you have. Have you ever heard of the Procter & Gamble symbol? That's on things that you would buy, items that you would buy at the grocery store. You remember that little symbol that has a circle with a half moon and the stars out beside? Supposedly, we were told several years ago, if you drew a line through those stars, you would see 666, and that was the mark of the beast. Well, Procter & Gamble, people were caught off guard by that. They were completely shocked. They had no idea. They said that wasn't the intent at all. And they went into the entire history of that symbol. Had nothing to do with the mark of the beast. Have you ever heard of the UPC symbol? In other words, everything that you buy at the grocery store, you have that computer code. You have to scan it. If you go through the self-checkout line like I do a lot, it frustrates Brenda no end. Go through the self-checkout line at Walmart and you scan it. You got to scan that UPC symbol. Well, there are those that when that UPC symbol first came out, they said, that's the mark of the beast. No, that's not the mark of the beast. Well, what about that little computer symbol on the back of the envelope? Sometimes you receive your bill and it has a computer thing on the back of the envelope. That's the mark of the beast. No, that's not the mark of the beast. What's the mark of the beast? The mark of the beast is a symbolic mark. In other words, it's a symbol. Just like everything else in Revelation is symbolic. It symbolizes something. What does it symbolize? It simply indicates the fact that unless and until you worship the beast, the emperor, Rome, then you're not going to be able to be successful in doing your commerce. You can't do your business successfully because Rome will see to it that you can't. In other words, you have to have some kind of an official approval to be able to do business. And to do that, you've got to indicate your obeisance, your submission to the Roman Empire, the Roman ruler, as supreme Lord and God. In other words, it is indicative of the choice, the real life choice that Christians had to make in the first century. They had some real choices to make that really had to do with their own welfare and even whether or not they're going to live. They were faced with the choice of either confessing Caesar estin Kyrion, Caesar is Lord, or Jesu Christos estin Kyrion, Jesus Christ is Lord. They had that choice to make. If they chose the latter, they would die. If they chose the former, they would live. Plain and simple. That's the choice that a lot of Christians over the years have had to make in the face of persecution. I'm sure you've heard the stories told about when the Chinese communists took over the late 1940s. Some of the first things that they did when they took power was they went to all of the churches and began to kill all of the religious leaders, including our brethren. They would come to congregations of the Lord's people, and they would identify the preacher, they would identify the leaders, the elders, deacons, and they would shoot them, kill them without any kind of question. And then they would pose it to the rest of the congregation. If you want to live, then reject this. If you want to die, then keep on worshiping. That was real life choices they had to make. And I wonder if we will ever have to make those kind of choices. I wonder if the day will come, I hope it never comes, but the day might well come in the future when you have armed soldiers that were immediately to come in to the front door of the church building and then say, if you want to live, then reject this religion. If you want to die, keep on worshiping. What choice would we make? I wonder what choice we would make. Those are real choices the brethren had to make in the first century. And that's the kind of choices that some brethren even today have to make. I've got a letter still from a brother in Christ from Utah back in 1991, I believe it was. And he was writing to the congregation where I was preaching at the time. We supported the work out there in Utah, a small congregation, right in the midst of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he wrote back to us and talked about some of the brothers that had obeyed the truth and the suffering, the actual physical suffering they were going through. Yes, they were being beaten. They were being persecuted. They were being verbally castigated because they had obeyed the gospel and left their former religion. That's in the United States. That's in the United States of America. And stuff like that was going on in 1991. Well, I hope we never have to go through that, but if we do, we need to be sure that we stand up for what's right and make the right choice like faithful brethren did in the first century and on. We need to make sure that we don't bow, that we don't succumb to pressure. We need to be like those three Hebrew children. You know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I like their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah refused to bow before the image of the king. He said, be it known to you, said, you can, in other words, paraphrasing, you can do what you want. But as for us, we're not going to bow down. We are not going to bow down. We need to have that same courage, that same resolution, that same fortitude. That's what brethren in this day and time, in the first century, had to do. They had those choices to make. So verse 18 then says, here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. For it is the number of a man. Notice that. And his number is 666. 666. It is my firm belief that that is a number that represents the Roman emperor as personified in Domitian. It is the number of a man. One man. Now there are some of my brethren that say that this refers to the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. No, not in that, actually, not in a direct sense. Now, could it be a secondary fulfillment of this? Maybe. I don't even know if I'd like to go even that far in saying that. There are a lot of similarities, admittedly, between this and the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. But that really takes it way out of the realm of when John wrote this book and when God intended for this book to be read and understood. It was intended, remember, for the brethren in Asia Minor. To know that there's going to come an apostate church 300 to 400 to 500 years down the road would give them no comfort. He's talking about things that were happening now and were about to happen in immediate sense. Could it be down the road this applies? It's possible, but I'm really not ready to say it would. Some good, sound, solid brethren, though, take that position. And over the years have taken that position. Some gospel preachers that I could name that you'd immediately recognize. But it's just the fact that if you're going to really interpret this book in its context, that is the context of its time, in the first century, then you've got to really stick with that. In other words, as Brother West said, put on your first century glasses. You've got to put on your first century glasses once you read Revelation. And make sure that the interpretation that is given fits that time. And so that's the reason why I put forward my position, at least, that this is talking about the Roman Empire as personified by Domitian, and also the committee, or the council, whatever you want to call it, to enforce that emperor worship throughout the empire. It makes the most sense to me, and really fits best, I think, into what Revelation is talking about. So, having said all that, any comments or questions or snide remarks before we... Yes, Alan.
I read somewhere that people knew so much about these symbols that they could, like, it wasn't all twisted up like it is to us, that they could figure it out, the ones who needed to, and so then it was useful.
Yes.
You know, if you say this represents Martin Luther, well, that wasn't useful, and it wouldn't be. And maybe it's fun to say, well, this guy knew something hundreds of years before it happened, but it wouldn't do any good.
That's a very good point. In other words, what Alan was saying was, you know, if this is referring to something hundreds of years down the road, it's not going to be useful to the brethren that read the book in the immediate sense. So it's got to be useful to them. They knew. You're absolutely right. The brethren to whom this was written knew exactly who John was talking about. I think they figured it out pretty quick because it was written for them. And there was a blessing pronounced upon the person who reads and understands. In other words, John intended for this to be understood. The Holy Spirit, Christ and God intended for this book to be understood by the people that received it. So it wasn't an impossible book for them. The symbols they were familiar with. They could figure it out pretty easily. Now, you take your average Roman centurion. He sees this book coming through customs, if that's what you want to put it. And he takes a look. Let me see this. And he takes a look through the scroll and he reads it. What? It's talking about a beast and a dragon and numbers? Oh, let him on through. In other words, it would be helpful in that sense. The Roman guards, the Roman centurions who might take a look at this had no clue what he's talking about. They couldn't make heads or tails out of it. And so that would help to get the message to those whom it needed to get to without reprisal and without the message itself being completely taken out of the way. So it had that dual purpose, these numbers and symbols and colors, to throw the Romans off the scent, as it were. And they'd say, oh, this is just gibberish. Just let it go through. So that's another thing to consider once you're reading this book with all of its symbols, is it was helpful in that regard. Any other comments? Questions? Yes, sir.
Just one observation in looking at Revelation. I've often wondered that since most of the New Testament is a book about how to live, why this book was even included in the New Testament.
The question is, since the rest of the New Testament seems about talking about how to live, why was this book included in the New Testament? It was included because of the persecution and the trouble that Christians were going through and the very real choice that many of them were making. In other words, they'd already seen many of their own brethren die. They had seen some of their own brethren apostatize and compromise with the truth. And so what they would naturally want to know is, what's the end of all this going to be? In other words, is Rome going to be judged? Is Rome going to be punished? What's the outcome of all of this? And this gives hope. It gives hope to these Christians that there's something better waiting, that Rome is not the one that has all power, They don't have all control. God is still on his throne. Christ is still on his throne. And if you remain faithful, you will receive a crown, and the enemies of God will be punished. That is a message that resonates. And that message resonates with faithful children of God throughout all centuries. And on top of that, you've got Revelation chapters 2 and 3, the description of the 7 churches. That describes every congregation of God's people today. You got every congregation described in some fashion or form in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. For that reason alone, it's worthwhile for us to have the book of Revelation. But the main thing is giving hope. Giving hope to those who are going through any kind of persecution intensely. They can read Revelation and still receive hope that there's going to be a better day coming. I think there's another question that was going to be asked. Oh, I did answer? Okay, well, I'm glad. Didn't even know I was going to answer a question.
That verse, chapter 10, I mean, not verse 10, kind of wrapped up that chapter.
Verse 10, yes. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Here it is. In other words, those who are persecuting you are going to be persecuted. They're going to be killed. Here's the reason that you can keep on going. Here's what gives you the purpose for moving forward. They're going to be judged, ultimately. You have the victory. So the victory's already been declared. So keep on going forward. Keep on living for the Lord. And that builds on what you're referring to about the New Testament being practical. In other words, why should we live for the Lord? Why should we live for this? It's because of the reward that's waiting on us. That's described, I believe, in chapters 20.